1865. In Springfield, Missouri, Davis Tutt engaged in a one-on-one pistol quick-draw duel with William Hickok. Tutt was killed. Hickok was charged with manslaughter. Mutual combat was against the law. Witnesses claimed both men fired, but Tutt was the initiator and the aggressor. Hickok claimed it was a question of honor. Had he not fought, he would have been branded a coward. Judge Sempronius Boyd instructed the jury that a conviction was its only option under the law, but added that the jury could call upon a more ancient law, the unwritten law of the fair fight, and acquit. The jury acquitted Hickok, who became better known as Wild Bill Hickok. 1693. In the second year of the Salem witch trials, after the executions of 33 convicted witches, jurors finally decided they did not have to be complicit with this injustice. The next 52 consecutive trials ended in hung juries or acquittals. So what is jury nullification? Juries have the right and the power to judge not only the facts, but also the law. The basis for this power are these legal truths. A jury cannot be punished for their verdict or forced to change it. An acquittal cannot be appealed. Jury nullification happens when a jury nullifies a law by acquitting a defendant regardless of the weight of evidence against him or her. In other words, it's when a jury finds that the evidence meets the standard of proof required for a conviction and still votes to acquit the accused, typically because they believe the law to be unjust or applied inappropriately. Let's say you believe in self-determination, that whatever a person decides to do with his or her own body or property, so long as it doesn't harm others or their properties, is none of the government's business. In that case, you may subscribe to the idea that if there's no victim or act of aggression towards another, then there's no crime. In Miami Shores Village in Florida, a couple was told that the front yard vegetable garden they'd tended to for 17 years was prohibited according to a new zoning code that banned front yard vegetable gardens. They had to dig up their plants, which supplied half the food they ate, or face $50 per day in fines. In 2017, the Florida Supreme Court declined to hear their case. If the couple were to request a jury trial, then the jurors would have the right to judge not only the facts of the case, but also whether the ordinance is just. You can pass judgment on the law. In 2012, a man in Oregon was sentenced to jail time and fines for having 3 ponds, one of which was 37 years old, on his 170-acre property. In 1925, his city had decided that all core sources of water belonged to the city. But in 2002, the city decided that rainwater should be included in that definition. Since rainwater was collecting in his ponds, suddenly this man was a criminal. An informed and principled jury could have deemed this law to be unjust. What about drugs? Many people would agree that the government is very inefficient at dictating what drugs we are allowed to think of as beneficial and which ones should be unquestioningly thought of as bad. In some states, people have voted to decriminalize the use of marijuana to some extent. But in most of the states, a person can still be jailed and have their rights stripped away for use or even possession. Why are these standards being applied unevenly? Because the legality of marijuana has been determined at the federal level, so it's actually still illegal in all 50 states. But the states which have decriminalized it have decided to nullify that law by ignoring it. They have decided that it is an unjust law, therefore it does not apply to them. In this country, positive change rarely comes from the lawmakers. It usually has to be forced on them by the people. When enough of us are fed up by tyrannical acts of aggression against our individual rights, we finally take action and enforce their hand. It was the government that gave us the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Under this law, stringent measures were imposed to catch runaway slaves, which included penalizing federal officials who did not enforce this law while rewarding those who did, requiring free citizens to help capture runaway slaves, fining or imprisoning citizens helping runaways to escape, prohibiting runaways from testifying on their own behalf in court, and denying jury trials to runaway slaves. This last one is especially interesting. It almost seems like an attempt to silence the will of the people. In response, the people used whatever means they could to defy and nullify the unjust laws. In Syracuse, New York, a jury effectively nullified the law by acquitting all but one of 26 people who had been arrested for freeing William Jerry Henry. He ultimately escaped to Canada. When Joshua Glover was captured by U.S. Marshals in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the sheriff supported local opinion by freeing Glover and jailing the Marshals. Glover also escaped to Canada. In Pennsylvania, a mob of free blacks killed a slaveholder attempting to capture a runaway. Military force was needed to disperse a mass meeting after a black man was apprehended in Detroit. Throughout Ohio, town meetings branded any Northern official who helped enforce the law an enemy of the human race. These acts of defiance and nullification against unjust laws eventually led to the Civil War and finally the end of legalized slavery in the United States. In 1919, thanks to some intentionally misleading language and typical political bait and switch techniques, the 18th Amendment was ratified to the Constitution. And despite the president's veto, a national ban on alcoholic drinks took effect in January of 1920. This attempt to stifle individual freedom of choice led to the rampant proliferation of widespread underground criminal activity, eerily similar to what we have as a result of the war on drugs. At first, nearly all of the states passed laws to enforce prohibition, as was specifically required in the text of the amendment. Maryland was the exception. By 1925, 6 states had passed laws to prevent police from investigating infractions. By 1928, 28 states had completely defunded prohibition enforcement. It was eventually noted that juries showed reluctance to convict their peers for violations which seemed insufficiently criminal to merit punishment. Finally, in 1933, the 18th Amendment was replaced by the 21st Amendment. Why isn't jury nullification happening more often? There are plenty of unjust laws, examples of government overreach and inappropriate ordinances. But in the overwhelming majority of jury trials, knowledge of the jury's right to nullify is actively suppressed. I remember the first time I had the privilege to serve on a jury. At the time, I had not studied and solidified the core philosophies and principles that today help me examine political and legal issues. I'd never heard of nullification. I was pretty much just like most of the other potential jurors. Looking back on it now, I remember some of the things the judge said during and after the selection process that struck me as somewhat odd at the time. I didn't think much of it though, because he was the authority on the law after all, right? The judge instructed us that we are only finders of facts, and that we could only apply the law as it was explained to us by him, and we were not to rely on our own interpretations of the law. At the time, I remember wondering for a moment why we were even there, if that was true. It's only now that I have a better understanding for the role of the jury that the memory of those instructions leaves a very bitter taste in my mouth. In 2011, the operator of a dispensary in California was convicted of possession and distribution. The jury was instructed to not question any conflict between state and federal law, but to consider the case under federal law only. Here's what the judge told the jury. You cannot substitute your sense of justice, whatever that means, for your duty to follow the law, whether you agree with it or not. It is not for you to determine whether the law is just or whether the law is unjust. That cannot be your task. There is no such thing as valid jury nullification. You would violate your oath and the law if you willingly brought a verdict contrary to the law given to you in this case. Naturally, the defendant appealed the conviction based on the judge's lie. Unfortunately for him, he appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court, who said that the error was harmless because there's no right to nullification. Anti-nullification rhetoric is certainly not strictly the realm of judges. Anyone who wishes to suppress the will and rights of the citizen will continue to look for ways to invalidate nullification. Rachel Maddow often portrays nullification as the creation of the 19th century Senator John C. Calhoun, who sought to use nullification to defend slavery before the Civil War. Because what better way to silence an idea you don't agree with than to call it racist? She even tries to claim the fact that nullification is illegal has already been settled. So if you declare yourself to be the winner of an argument before it starts, then your arguments don't have to be very good. Notice the subtle association attempt in the caption of this picture on her article. So some in the legal community will tell you that even though you have the power to nullify, you don't have the right to nullify. This statement is false. Here are some precedents. The Alien and Sedition Acts, fugitive slave laws as discussed, alcohol prohibition laws as discussed. Chief Justice John Jay, U.S. Supreme Court, Georgia v. Brailsford, 1794. The jury has a right to judge both the law as well as the facts in controversy. Samuel Chase, Supreme Court Justice, 1804, signer of the Declaration of Independence. The jury has the right to determine both the law and the facts. Though the legality of jury nullification actually is settled, the ability to inform people of the jury's right to nullify is constantly under attack. A popular method to spread awareness is to pass out information flyers about juries' rights. The Fully Informed Jury Association has several of these flyers available for purchase or free download. But there are plenty of videos showing activists being harassed by security and law enforcement while trying to pass out these flyers. Plenty of people don't want this truth to be public knowledge, so be careful. This activity has been shown lawful with the 1983 Supreme Court case of United States v. Grace, which held that public sidewalks, even surrounding a court building, are historically considered public forums associated with the free exercise of expressive activities, and thus are public forums for First Amendment purposes. But the tricky part is, if they can show that you are targeting jurors, you can still get in trouble. So if you're lucky enough to be given the privilege of jury duty, and you'd like the opportunity to make your contribution to justice, FlexYourRights.org has some tips on how to make it past the voir dire, or jury selection process. Step 1. Be a quitter, temporarily. After you receive your jury summons, you should immediately cancel membership with organizations that might get you struck from the jury. These include, but are not limited to, the Fully Informed Jury Association, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, the Drug Policy Alliance, the Libertarian Party, the Marijuana Policy Project, and the ACLU. Failure to mention your affiliation with groups you belong to might get you into legal trouble. It would be useful to unlike and unfollow Facebook and Twitter groups that advocate jury nullification or reform of drug laws, as these days lawyers sometimes check. You can always rejoin them later when your jury duty term is over. Step 2. Tell the truth and shut up. Take the questions literally. Answer as briefly and generally as you truthfully can. Do you have any political, religious, or philosophical beliefs that might prevent you from delivering a verdict based on the facts? Not at all. I want to decide a fair and just outcome. How do you feel about people accused of breaking the law in question? They deserve fair trials, like anyone accused of a crime. If it is proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime, can you set your opinions aside and vote guilty? Yes, I can. As trial lawyer and jury nullification expert Clay Conrad notes in response to this question, of course you can. You can also shove your arm down a garbage disposal. That does not mean you are committed to doing so. The goal is to present an open mind that is concerned with fairness and the facts. Step 3. Do not mention nullification in the jury room. Just don't do it. If the judge believes that a juror is thinking about nullification, they will likely remove that juror. But if the juror simply has doubts on the facts of the case, the juror cannot be removed. The inability to discuss jury nullification openly encourages hung juries. So if you must, hang. Even if the other jurors pressure you, stay true to your principles. Vote your conscience. A not guilty verdict might save someone's life. The likelihood of going to jail for using jury nullification is remote. Regardless, these basic precautions can help you flex your constitutional rights without risking jail time. The greater risk is getting struck from the jury before you get a chance to use your jury nullification right. Like, subscribe, and share this video to spread the word about jury nullification. The opportunities we have to affect positive change in this world are getting fewer and fewer. Don't let this one pass you by.